Hey everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Raise podcast, where we get under the hood of founder scaling stories. Will and I are here with James Millar, Chief Exec of Entocycle. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Hi, Will. Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for making the time. So we normally start with getting into a little bit about you and the business, so the listeners understand, what it is you're trying to solve. Really, what's the problems? Tell us a little bit about you, Entocycle, and the problem that you are solving.
All right, so a little bit about me. So I spent the last 10 years immersed in the startup space, either as a founder, as an entrepreneur in residence, or a director of a startup accelerator. I have a sort of a background in the corporate sector, so I was part of the early stage back when Amazon was started in the UK. Now, just over a year ago, I stepped into the CEO role at Entocycle. Now, Entocycle is an engineering and technology firm. We develop and build industrial scale insect facilities that turn the problematic food waste around the world into high value protein that you use in animal feed. Now, the problem that we're trying to solve, so protein has a demand problem. If you accept that two macro things are true, one is that the global population will continue to grow at a rate of knots and developing countries will continue to eat more meat, then protein demand, so the things that we use to feed animals, will continue to grow. And that's why the aquaculture industry, so the farming of fish, and the poultry industries are set to double over the next 25 years. And traditional proteins cannot meet this demand. So overfishing of the seas means fish meal production can't scale any further. And soy production is so inherently linked to deforestation. And that's where insects come in. You can take the byproducts and the waste of the food that we produce today, feed it to insects, and they turn into a sustainable source of protein for things like poultry and aquaculture production.
Okay, so I've learned quite a few things in that 2 minutes, and I think the question I was going to ask is, why did insect protein attract so much attention from investors over the last decade? I think you've just answered it, but did we know all of that a decade ago, effectively?
Yeah, I think we did, but I think people weren't necessarily feeling the pain of it. And I think, that protein demand problem is such a huge and demonstrable problem. It's already happening. Yeah. And I think when you add that it's steeped in circularity and sustainability, it naturally attracted the interest of investors all around who put, significant capital in, particularly because it's a deep tech solution. Therefore, the potential exit returns later were there to had and sort of tried to scale the industry.
Yeah. Okay. This is going to be interesting. Over to you, William.
Absolutely. So you recently wrote an article on the sort of first wave of commercial failures in the sector. What prompted that?
Yeah, good question. So the industry has had a storied last 18 months. So a number of high profile failures has led to a lot of speculation that the industry is doomed. And naturally now a lot of people piled on and predicted that the industry was finished. Now we started to see that play out in conversations with investors, in customers. And by the way, I'm not a sort of prolific social media guy. I don't generally post a lot, but I thought it was important to set out that this is a new industry and one that's in growth. And in new and growing industries, it's a normal maturity phase that there is failure and consolidation, and that the way the industry originally thinks about how it will deploy evolves and changes over time. And so I wrote that article really to try and set out the counter argument to what was a lot of sort of hyperbole and sort of doomsday saying about where the industry was at, which just isn't the case.
Yeah, okay. Why do you think it is that sort of emerging industries tend to go through these hype cycles and sort of boom bust almost?
Yeah, so the go-to model here is the Gartner hype cycle. And I think once a new industry emerges, there's a gold rush to be part of it. Investors kick big money in to try and be part of that sort of first mover advantage and that land grab, if you like, of market share. But building new technology and a new industry is really hard. And so there is a natural period of correction where stuff takes longer and costs more than you'd like. And it's actually called the trough of disillusionment. And not all of those companies that attract that first wave of investment, make it through. And that's where the insect industry is today. And I think only the most sort of commercially rigorous models will kind of live to see the next phase of growth.
It's almost a natural cleansing.
Yeah, I think so.
Do you think that the sector maybe overestimated demand or potentially underestimated execution? Potentially a bit of both?
Yeah, I think we see there's some common threads that run through why these companies failed. So it's probably worth sort of laying those out. So I think firstly, when you deploy quickly and at big scale, you run the risk of doing your R&D in real time. And that means the technology that underpins your solution is inherently early stage and it's likely to be expensive. And look, at Entocycle, we've got 10 years of R&D scar tissue that sort of backs that up. I think secondly, that the business models that typically sat behind these facilities had big sustainabilities attached to the products that came out the other end, way beyond sort of the price benchmarking of the industry. And if you take these away, the business models then become under significant pressure. I think we also saw in Europe that government subsidies into waste to energy facilities, so things like anaerobic digestion, mean that the inputs to those facilities are competitive, so people are paying for them. And if you couple that with some of the highest labor rates and utility rates in the world, as Europe has, then again, it puts significant pressure on the business model. And then I think underneath all of that, when virtually all of these facilities took longer to scale up or never actually reached their sort of announced capacity. And that has a big revenue implication and a big cash burn implication. And when startups are building with that level of capital, inherently those facilities have little or no balance sheet resilience. So when things take longer and things cost more, you're going cap in hand back to investors. And that's always a challenging conversation. But I think ultimately, the compound effect of those patterns stacked one on top of each other makes businesses really, really hard to scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And what surprised you the most sort of as the market matured?
I think the speed of that correction was I think caught the industry a little bit surprised. Over the last 18 months, we've seen 3 large scale failures in this space. That's made it super easy for people to pile on and say the industry is doomed. And like I said before, it's not. It's a maturity stage that at this moment you can see it in the insect industry, the industry that we work in, but you can see that across deep tech industries, from electric vehicles, vertical farming has had its moment there. Dare I say AI at some point will have its moment as well. And I think it's just a normal maturity phase for a sort of a capital intensive market.
Yeah, progression is never linear, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so let's go on to a little bit more about, climate startups and the challenges around that. So, do you sort of feel that funding is basically the problem, or is that a bit too simplistic, would you think?
I think the type of funding has been a problem. And I think in this sector, and you could probably draw this conclusion in sort of several climate tech verticals, the type of capital matters. Venture capital is best used, in my view, for sort of high return IP and tech development, but industrial scale projects, so building factories and sort of capital heavy solutions, require a distinct type of capital because it's based much more on stable yields than sort of spiky exits. And that typically more comes through sort of infrastructure finance. And our belief is that the next phase of this industry will be that the next facilities won't be built with VC money, but with the same sort of infrastructure capital that funds and builds projects in waste management and clean energy and renewables.
Quite timely, because I think, Alex.
No, go for it, yeah.
Private credit is just having a boom at the moment, right? And everybody's talking about it. Everybody wants to get into it. So if you're sort of saying that's where you see the need and that's where the capital is best aligned, that's quite timely. That must be a good thing, right?
I think so, but it also means the burden of proof is way higher. And in order to unlock that capital, the level of validation that you need to be able to demonstrate across the business model, across the technology, across the project, whether that's the site or the inputs or the outputs, or whatever, is super, super high. And it means the implication for companies like ours is that the sales cycles are inherently longer. And that takes a level of patience and a different type of commercial rigor than when your sales cycles are kind of much shorter and much quicker to iterate.
Okay. So do you feel there's an obvious separation for companies that do or don't survive?
I think there will be commonalities in the businesses that do. And I think maturity is probably a really, it's hard to measure maturity so much, but I think it's really important. So those businesses, like what you need in that 0 to 1 phase is wildly different to what you need for the 2 to 10 bit. And the 2 to 10 bit's the bit I like to play, and I find it more interesting than the 0 to 1. And I've done the 0 to 1 bit, and I've been a founder, and it's hard. And I think in our industry, we're building multi-million-pound factories that, like I said before, can take up to 2 years to develop, and they have a really high burden of proof. That takes a level of commercial expertise and rigor, and just a laser focus on taking risk out of projects. I think the companies that are able to do that and effectively put a bow on that capital for the investor, they're the companies that will thrive in this sector.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make. So that sort of 0 to 1, do you feel or do you see mistakes that are like always made? Like, you know, it is a very obvious thing that you sort of see founders making, mistake-wise.
Question. I think, and I used to talk about this because I used to be part of the Startup Accelerator in London, and believing the upside that you've pitched to investors versus the reality. And I think we've all done it, and the actual reality is much, much harder. It's almost like you drink your own Kool-Aid at some point.
I'm literally about to say, drinking your own Kool-Aid.
Don't believe your own hype. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Easily done though.
Yeah,
Very
for sure.
much so, yeah. So you talked there about, what you need 0 to 1 is wildly different from what you need 2 to 10, right? So how has Entocycle evolved as you have matured, as the market's matured?
Yeah, and I think it's worth making a more general point that the way that you grow businesses is changing, right? And 5 years ago, which is nothing, you would raise, a Series A. We did a Series A back in 2023, and you would hire a bunch of people. It would take you 6 months to hire your people, 6 months to properly onboard them, as much as, you like to think it's less. And so then you're 12 months later before you really start to see any value that comes from that. Now, LLMs will mean you can scale and iterate way quicker and way faster than before. And so the way you scale businesses is changing. You can stay leaner. And particularly, we're in an inflation cycle, which means high interest rates alongside it. And that means capital's harder to come by. And so I think in many ways that's changing the way that founders and sort of people that are running startups actually scale those businesses. I think for Entocycle, we spent the last 10 years as a wildly introverted R&D focused business. And as we've sort of exited that R&D phase, we've completely retooled the business, because the people and the resources that you need at that R&D stage is different to the people and the resources that you need to commercialize the business. And that means some tough choices for sure. And that stuff is hard. But now our focus is on just developing these de-risked, investable projects for the customers that we work with. And like I said before, the sales cycle's long, the burden, the proof's high. But if we get that right, the reward is huge.
Yeah. So as you've moved from that introverted R&D company to more customer focused, how have the customer conversations changed?
Yeah, I think it's less about proving our technology now. And I say that because we have 10 years of R&D data, 2 years of production data from the facility that we built in London. And so those conversations are much easier to navigate because it exists. It's now about proving that the projects we work on can be de-risked and we can validate the metrics in the business model. And so that means those conversations have a base level of credibility attached to them that they didn't 5 years ago.
Okay. And what have you had to become more disciplined about?
Question. I think we are super disciplined now about what we work on and how we allocate resources, both time and money. I think I'm really clear about what we need to get done in the next 12 months. And we are getting better and better at filtering out the noise in order to make that happen. And it means we make some hard choices on stuff that we actively choose not to work on. And that could be R&D stuff or project sort of opportunities, but it means that there's no sort of hiding place for not getting the core stuff done that absolutely has to happen for Entocycle to kind of thrive in that next phase.
Yeah. Okay. And you talked just a minute ago about the differences even in 5 years, right? Building a business now versus scaling a business 5 years ago and how wildly that's changed. And it is, I mean, it's a really sort of exponential curve at the moment. What advice, if any, would you give to any founders, whether that's 0 to 1 or 2 to 10, that are just trying to scale in the current market?
Yeah, I'd go back to that point I made about the way you do it is different now. And so staying lean has priority in this market because, you know, as founders and as being in startups, like fundraising is a full-time gig. And so if you want to take yourself out of that business for 6 months to do a proper fundraise, that comes at a cost, an opportunity cost that you're not in the business. And so for those founders in the early stage businesses, the implication of being out of your business for 6 months is actually pretty huge. So if you can stay lean and actually get more stuff done and get your proof points and your milestones banked rather than kind of on your hypothetical pitch deck, then actually the valuation of your company is worth more. So when you actually go to raise capital, the likelihood that you will bank that capital goes up. But not only that, you're likely to be able to raise at a high valuation because what you've proved that you can do is more believable and more credible.
Quick question about fundraising. Do you think that businesses or founders that are in the 2 to 10 phase, do you think fundraising should still be founder-led at that point? Because I almost think it shouldn't be, but increasingly I see that it still is. And I feel like, as the point you just identified there, it's so time consuming and then therefore so distracting and resource draining. And I feel that I understand why, but I think quite often founders stay attached to that perhaps for too long. Wondering if you agree.
This is a good question. So, and the reason being is that I didn't found Entocycle. So Entocycle has a founder, Kieran, who it is adept at fundraising. Like it's his sort of secret sauce. And I was sort of brought in to do that 2 to 10 growth phase part. Now, inherently, I get involved in the fundraising, and we end up sort of doing it in tandem because investors want to hear from the founders, and it's really important that they know that founders are still actively involved in the business, and you know they're also such a big part of the shareholding. But they also want to hear what the growth strategy is, what the business strategy is, what the hiring plans are, all those things. And so we end up doing, and it almost, for us specifically, potentially it's, you know, as we think about maybe a Series B next year, then that potentially becomes inefficient because it requires two of us. But I think investors will always want to hear from the founders. It's important. Seeing that those founders are still involved in the business is important. I suspect investors will see it as a red flag if they're not. But again, what the way that we have sort of evolved roles over time at Entocycle is a result of what you need to get done in that minute evolves and changes and frankly matures over time. And so then we start to sort of repurpose people on different things as well.
So therefore, is the answer not a founder recognizing this and hiring a CEO earlier than you might normally expect to do so to help that situation?
I don't know that it's as linear as that, because some founders make really good CEOs, right? Like that's not, it doesn't mean you can't be both. I think having a strategic advisor that can tell you the stuff like that this is the stuff that you're going to need to tackle to hit the next phase of growth, and having those honest conversations is really, really important. And we're lucky at Entocycle in that we've got a couple of really good advisors to the business that are super supportive of what the company's doing and where we're going, but at the same time, not afraid to have difficult conversations with us. And I think finding somebody where you can strike that balance is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our guests are in that sort of hardware space, and it just seems that from an investment perspective, it's very, very challenging. You know, I think it has been for a while, but it seems incredibly difficult at the moment. But do you feel that investor expectations have really changed? Or what do you feel about that?
Yeah, and I think that's true. They have. And like I said before, inflation and interest rates will mean that deployment of capital gets harder. or attraction of capital gets harder. And therefore the poring over balance sheet and unit economics and the data room, it is probably never been more sort of scrutinized. AI, by the way, will also sort of make that more challenging because it's easier to find gaps in a company's data room, right? So I think that plays a part. So yes, I think investor expectations are changing, and we've seen, we have VC funds within the business. Those funds have sort of maturity cycle, so to say, and climate tech, any company that's developing deep technology has a long lead time to scale and develop and grow and eventually sort of position themselves that they can exit. One of the biggest challenges that the sector has is that there is often a soft conflict between the time it takes for that to truly develop and the maturity of the fund that sits behind the VC capital. Answers on a postcard, because I don't think anyone's fixed that problem yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's pretend right now you were going to be investing in a climate startup. What would make you nervous?
I think an underestimation of the capital intensity or the time it takes to develop, build, and prove this stuff. I think that's probably number one. And then I think number two would be a reliance on either sustainability premiums or sort of government subsidies to make the business model work.
Yeah.
And ultimately the business model has to stand up on its own, and it's highly likely that this stuff will take longer and cost more than you think.
Yeah. I mean, we've got clients that it's chicken and egg. So they got investors that are interested. So we'll just prove the pilot, and then, we'll invest in getting this, properly to projects. So we need the money to prove the pilot. Very, very challenging space at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And look, pilot facilities are just a hot topic in our industry because there are still companies out there that are looking to build pilot facilities and then build the other one. And look, our view on this is that the industry is at a sufficient level of maturity that if the time it takes to build a pilot facility, make it work, then build the next facility, you're dead. The industry is already beyond that. The industry is now deploying commercial scale, industrial scale projects. And so no other company has the time to do that. There is a time-based diseconomy of that. Even if, we've been doing this for 10 years, even if you threw money and people at the problem, you can't catch that up. And so I think now actually it's about, if you haven't already developed your own technology, find a partner to work with, find a collaboration or a JV to explore, because catching that up is a really sort of challenging thing to do.
Do you think, on that JV note, do you think that can work? Because a lot of people that I speak to sort of feel that it feels and sounds good as an idea, but the actual reality is it's pretty tough to actually make it work.
Yeah, they can. I think incentive alignment is everything. And look, I used to work in the sort of accelerator space, connecting startups with corporates. And that's a really good example where you often just had a misalignment. The startup as a much smaller entity with less leverage, corporate with lots of leverage, has no idea how to work with startups and the pace and the pressures that they're under. And so you sort of have that misalignment of objectives. I think if you can find companies where you can align on the incentives, you both want the same mutual outcome, then JVs can absolutely work. But the devil's in the detail of that stuff, right? And finding contracts that work and things like that is not an easy gig.
Yeah, it's more about that DD before anything to make sure it's a good setup. And I think that, to your point, you're exactly right, is that people getting to bed with one another without really looking at the bigger picture first makes sound good, like short term, but long term, and that's why people get it wrong. You're totally right.
Yeah.
If you're trying to balance, so you're sort of saying companies maybe need to skip the pilot stage, you're kind of dead in the water if you do. And I get that. How do companies, though, balance getting that R&D scar tissue that you talked about, that you get through the iterations, and sort of, how do you balance that?
Yeah. And so to be clear, I'm not saying don't ever build a pilot factory. I'm just saying in our industry specific, the stage of building pilot factories and testing it was sort of 3 or 4 years ago. And if you're new coming into this space, that's a really challenging model because you will always be developing behind the curve of the industry. And so then that's hard to make work. The how do you get the R&D scar tissue bit? I think we were lucky in many ways because we had the right and patient investors, because we spent a long time in that R&D space that, we were afforded all of the room to make that happen and build up a really interesting sort of bank of data and a suite of IP and patents that help us into that next phase. I'm not sure if we found investors in this market tomorrow that you would get nearly that level of time runway to go and figure that stuff out.
Yeah. Was that something that you actively screened for, if that's even possible, or was that just timed it right? They were patient at that time, but as you say, if you had investors tomorrow, they probably wouldn't be.
Yeah, look, I could try and give you a really clever answer on that. That was all of our strategy from the start. But at the point that you're raising that capital, so little about, what it's going to look like later. I think it sort of happened serendipitously, and so I think we found good investors that believed in the business and this is, way back when, and believed in Kieran, the founder, and sort of bought into that narrative that the way proteins are sort of farmed in the global food system is fundamentally broken, and bought into that idea that something needs to fix it. And I think once you get alignment on mission, and we're a mission-driven organization, right? That's how it started. Then I think it then makes it easier to spend that time and have the patience to see this through, as long as you can demonstrate that you're being productive with that time. And so for us, that's patents being filed, really interesting milestones being hit and stuff being figured out. And I think that's probably bought us the time more than a kind of strategic play right at the start to ask for it or find investors that like us taking 10 years.
Yeah. Finding the right investor then, I mean, incredibly important.
Yeah, it is. It is. But if you've got an idea and you want to move really quickly to exploit that idea for first mover advantage or whatever it might be, the conflict between the time it takes to kiss as many frogs as you need to find the right investor and getting capital in the door to crack on is really hard. It's a classic sort of early stage startup problem.
Very interesting world. So looking forwards then, what are you sort of most excited about in the future of Entocycle and your part of the market, really?
Let me answer you in a relatively guided way, because I don't want to give away sort of too much of what we're working on. But I'm genuinely excited about the next 12 months. And I think go back to that macro challenge that we're trying to solve. And you may have seen in the news that we have this El Nino weather pattern that's going to last through to spring. That will bring further disruption to the supply of traditional proteins. And that means that the time to put insects back into the animal food chain is like now. And we're working on some really interesting projects to kind of make that work at industrial scale. I think in parallel to that, when markets go through this kind of correction that we've been talking about, it means that there are plenty of left field opportunities to exploit, and exploring those opportunities is super interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's very exciting. We'll be watching. Do you think the industry is aware of that? So that El Nino, you're coming at it from the insider knowledge, I guess, of saying, look, El Nino is happening. We need to be aware of it. We need to act now. Are the sort of customers in the industry as aware of that, or is there a big educational piece required?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty known impact on the industry for sure.
Yeah. Okay. And what sort of lessons do you think you need to carry from day zero, but from first generation, all the failures that we've talked about across the industry? What do you sort of need to carry then forwards to ensure success, if that's possible?
Yeah. So I think de-risking these projects to make them investable is everything. And that means like verifiable data-driven metrics, sort of removing sustainability premiums from business models, and just a really credible plan on how you build and ramp up these factories that we build. And I think I've made all that sound really straightforward, and the reality is anything but I think ultimately being able to demonstrate that you can de-risk the deployment of the thing that you've spent that long developing is really, really important.
Totally agree. What capability then becomes increasingly important for you to be able to do that?
Commercial model that works. And I think, look, if we reluctantly accept that political instability and war is our new normal for a minute, reluctantly, then I think slowing down the impact we're having on the planet will remain less of a priority. And we've seen that play out over the last few years, unfortunately. If you can demonstrate a business model that works, then companies that are sort of built on a sustainable mission like ours will continue to thrive, even though it's not led by the sustainability narrative that got us from 0 to 1. And I think that's the key change in our business, that we now lead with the commercial model. It doesn't mean we're any less driven by the desire to replace or offset unsustainable food production, but the way that we talk to investors about that, the way that we talk to customers about that has definitely evolved, because the world we're operating in is changing immeasurably kind of all the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. We had a previous episode where one of the guests on was talking about exactly that journey and transition from sort of going from being this really disruptive company that's changing everything and is really exciting, and then inherently there's probably some risk associated with that, to then maturing into this, we're very boring. It's all fine. It's very risk free over here. Putting yourself in a position where you're right for, project finance, private credit, things like that. So that journey is an interesting kind of maturity curve to go on, I guess.
Yeah. And look, the risk is that we're constantly calibrating whether we're getting it right, whether we're getting the balance of those things right. And, we're lucky we have a great marketing lead in Georgie, and her job is to make sure that sustainability mission and sort of messaging remains sort of threaded through everything that is in the business, whilst at the same time leading with the commercial thing. And like, we're constantly calibrating that. We can learn from that all the time, I think.
Okay, so let's move on to something a bit different then. So is there a company that you're really sort of pumped about, excited, or you just simply admire in terms of what they've done or what they're doing in your world?
I'll give you 3. Monzo for comms, because I love the way that they make something really complicated and dull quite accessible. Love that.
I agree with that.
Patagonia for clarity of mission.
Okay.
Because I think they're just super clear about what they are, and I love that.
Yeah.
And because I have 2 kids, Lego for being constantly able to reinvent themselves. Like toy brand in the 70s or whenever it was, then became a licensing house, and now they're basically a studio. Like, fascinating company.
Yeah. Have you watched a documentary on Lego?
No. Where?
It's excellent.
All right.
I'm a Lego guy.
All right.
The thing I love about it
on Amazon Prime. Is top
yeah. I lost hours to that program. Yeah, I think I love about it as well. I've got a Ferrari, I think it's the 450 underneath my sofa waiting to be built, but my little one is just turned 4 and it was a bit of a choking hazard. But then equally, I've got Lego over here, which is perfect for him. It's so good. I absolutely love it.
I agree. It's great.
Okay, so what's one hill you'll die on that the rest of the industry maybe disagrees with? Tough question, that.
Yeah, tough question. VCs won't fund factories, infrastructure capital will, if you demonstrate you can package it up correctly. So VCs won't fund factories, infra capital will.
Yeah, I think we're really seeing that with our clients and guests as well. I totally agree with that. And then what's one thing you wish you'd known 5 years ago?
One thing I wish I'd had 5 years ago was decent LLMs. And so I have a background in e-commerce, and I think about sort of the minutiae of like writing product descriptions and metadata and stuff, and like how quickly businesses would have scaled back then, because you wouldn't have to deploy people and resource and energy to do that. And so I look at how we've been able to go faster as a result of AI, and I wish we'd had that 5 years ago, because where we would be different. Yeah.
The efficiencies as well. Well, look, I think that's we're pretty much out of time. But look, thank you very much for joining us, and love to have you back on another sort of 9-12 months, or maybe after the Series B, to sort of go through this sort of stuff again. That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, Alex, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on, James.
Cheers.